The psalmist writes, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." I suspect that if you were to think about it, you can certainly relate, or at least I know that I can. Most of the time it's when I'm back in Louisiana, specifically at a restaurant called Galatoire's, while eating a dozen oyster Rockefeller. Every time I see Marion's uncle, he still talks about remembering the first time that I had them. "You should have seen the look on your face," he will say. "It looked like you died and gone to heaven." I wonder what it is for you. Perhaps it's your meal at your favorite restaurant that no matter how many times you have it, it's always divine. Or maybe it's a one-time experience at a place you'll never go again, but will always remember the first bite and saying, "Oh my God." Or maybe it's the comfort of a dish you had growing up to which you still, to this day, attribute God's love. We all associate something of God's goodness to that which we eat. Or at least those are the prayers we learn early on. God is great, God is good. Let us thank God for our food. Or my personal favorite, good food, good meat, good God, let's eat. In fact, we as part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ may tend to go a little overboard with it at times, which is probably the reason Susie chose one particular item for her show and tell that day. Her kindergarten class was to bring one religious symbol that represented their particular faith tradition. Well, first up was little Mary, and she said to the class, "Hi, my name's Mary. I'm a Catholic, and this is a rosary. We use this to pray." Next up was little Joshua. He says, "Hi, my name's Joshua. I'm Jewish. This is a yarmulke. We use this to cover our heads during worship." Finally, little Susie comes forward and says to the class, "Hi, my name's Susie. I'm a disciple, and this is a casserole." It's no wonder we, at times, as disciples, have been accused of making too much of a good meal. Or at least that was Michael Kinnaman's experience. He's the former General Secretary of the National Council of Churches and was at one time a candidate for President, General Minister and President of our denomination. He was with his family in India, where he was teaching a summer semester at the United Theological School in the city of Bangalore. During their 4 months in that city, they attended St. Mark's, a congregation of the Church of South India. St. Mark celebrates communion every Sunday like we do, but it does so in a rather time-consuming, some would say rather tedious way. Everyone lines up in the center aisle and comes forward perhaps 10 at a time to a railing around the table, and since the church is large, this can take more than a half an hour. After a few times of going there, he couldn't help but notice that lots of people simply left after the sermon and skipped communion altogether. "Why do they leave?" he asked a friend at the church. "Oh," he said, "those are former Methodists or Presbyterians. They don't take communion every week, and besides, it takes so long." Then he turned the question around. "Why," he asked, "do you stay?" But before Kinnaman could answer, his friend said, "Oh yeah, you're part of those disciples, those people who are obsessed with eating bread." Which physically is apparently not so good for us. With all the low-carb diets out there like Atkins and keto, bread is apparently our enemy, something to which we ought to avoid at all times. But for the church, well, bread is more like a faithful saint. One might even say it's the best evangelist we've ever had. Just ask the Torberts. I'm not sure they have specific numbers, but my guess is they would tell you that when they offer a meal here at Sandy Springs Christian Church on a Sunday morning, worship attendance increases at least 20%. In fact, you probably could capture the Church Universal pretty well if you simply modified Kevin Costner's character's quote from Field of Dreams, changing it from "if you build it, they will come" to "if you feed them, they will come." And my guess is Jesus must have known this too. After all, he spent so much of his time eating and drinking with others, he's accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. Actually, it's so central to his ministry, it's no wonder he leaves a meal behind by which to remember him. Eat, drink, remember me. You see, Jesus knows the power of a good meal. He knows that perhaps even more than touch, perhaps even more than any of our senses, taste has the power to break down walls, smash through barriers, reconcile relationships, and create community. Which is the reason I can't help but think Jesus must have known Psalm 34, maybe even by heart. Taste and see the Lord is good. David writes this just after he's tasted something of God's goodness. He's fleeing from his life from Saul. God has anointed David to be the next king, but Saul doesn't want David to take his throne. David finds himself in Philistia, the home of Goliath, whom David has just killed. David comes before the king of Philistia to be judged, but David manages to play a trick on the king and escapes unscathed. In the end, David believes God has delivered him from what appeared to be impossible circumstances. So you can imagine the reason for which David is singing God's praise in this psalm. You can imagine in this moment how God tastes to David. Or at least I certainly can. After all, that's what I find myself doing when I come to the communion table each and every week. Don't you? I may not be reciting this psalm, but words of praise fill my mouth. Thank you, O God, for all you've given me. Thank you, O God, for being present to me. Thank you, O God, for dwelling within me. Last year, the culinary world lost two of its brightest lights. Anthony Bourdain, the famous chef who exposed us to food throughout the world through shows like No Reservations and Parts Unknown, took his own life at a French hotel. And Los Angeles Times food critic Jonathan Gold, who became the first food critic to ever win the Pulitzer Prize, died of pancreatic cancer. While they offered us different perspectives about food through their different mediums, they communicated the same truth about what we eat. That food cannot be divorced from the people making it, the culture that inspires it, and the communities it sustains. Food, both literally and figuratively, stays with you after you consume it, always leaving a mark on you one way or another. Which got me thinking about the way I taste, or rather, how we taste Sandy Springs Christian Church. I mean, if the food we serve here represents something of who we are and who our God is, well, what is the world tasting of God through you and me? Is it sweet or sour? Is it fresh or spoiled? Is it full of flavor or simply tasteless? I had a mentor in Kentucky named John Wesley. He served First Christian Church in Bowling Green for more than 18 years. Recently, the Christian Church Foundation created a video about their church, specifically emphasizing the church's endowment, which they've been intentional about growing for many years. Today, that endowment is over $3 million, and the monies that the saints of the church have left as legacy gifts to the church are used over and above for outreach and capital expenditures. I was part of a peer group that met regularly, and we invited John to join us just before his retirement to share some of his wisdom from over 40 years of ordained ministry. During the course of our conversation, one of my colleagues asked him, "So, what are you most proud of in your ministry?" He paused, and then he replied, "You know, you might think I'm most proud of our endowment, or the way we've transformed our facility, or some of the outreach projects we've taken on. Don't get me wrong, I'm proud of those things. But the truth is, I'm most proud. Or maybe proud's not the word. I'm most humbled by a letter I received from a congregant. It said, "I'm grateful to you for being pastor to a church where everyone is truly welcome at the table. There is no other church in our community like this. No matter orientation or ethnicity or socioeconomic status, we all truly have a place at the table. Everyone is welcome to taste and see how good God is." It sounds so basic, so simple if you think about it. How just a taste can change everything. And yet I experience it all the time. Most recently, it was in my daughter Clara. I've told you all before that when we ask her which church she prefers to attend, mommy's or daddy's, she always says daddy's church because they take communion every Sunday, and I like sharing that with my friends. And besides, she says, I always get a little hungry, need a snack. That little snack, that little taste, it showed up the last day of school this year. The kids were all supposed to bring $5 to enjoy snow cones from the Kona ice truck. When it came time to go outside to get their treat, one little boy had forgotten his money. Clara's teacher told us that as soon as Clara found out, she said, "It's okay. He can have mine." Of course, they both ended up having Kona ice that day. No one was excluded. So it was no coincidence when I opened up her lunchbox later that day that all that was left inside were some bread crusts and some grape stems. Some bread crusts, some grape stems. You know, Jesus said we are the salt of the earth. But can people truly taste it? Do they sense in us the flavor of God's hospitality? Do they experience in us the zest of God's generosity? Do they know in us the seasoning of God's love and grace for all people? After all, long before Bourdain and gold, it was Jesus who taught us that the food we prepare and serve always tells a story about who we are. Which Bishop Cameron was reminded of on a mission trip to Bosnia several years ago. She was bishop of the United Methodist Conference in Virginia while we lived there. She shared a story from that trip in a sermon one time. Of course, they were there not long after the Bosnian War had taken place in the mid-90s. Tensions were still present. Naturally, people didn't trust one another given the atrocities that took place during that war, including genocide, attempts at ethnic cleansing. Especially, strangers were not trusted. As a result, there was one primary rule for those on the trip. Above all other rules, there was one that was not to be broken. Do not eat anything offered to you from a stranger. The group was on a bus driving from one place to another when Bishop Cameron saw a man working in a field by himself. For some reason, she was just struck by him. She asked the bus driver to pull over so she could talk to him, but the bus driver said, "No, you really don't want to do that. You have no idea who that is. We don't know what's in that field." The bishop, however, wouldn't relent. So finally, the bus driver stopped the bus. She went straight out into the field, spoke a few words in English, broken language, barriers of communication. But he did make out that she was a Christian. She was asking about his field and his crops. Next thing she knew, she was being led into his home so that she might taste some of his food. She knew this was against the rules. Everyone on that bus was looking out the windows in awe. She described his house as a small shack. It wasn't clean. No running water, no bathroom, just one room. He cleared off an area on a table. He went to the shelf and unwrapped some bread. It was obvious he'd been rationing it. There was barely any left. This was all he had. And yet he broke what little was left in half, put the 2 pieces on the table. She looked at the bread. It had mold all over it. He took some of the jam that he'd made from his fields off the shelf, spread it all over the bread. She was happy the jam was covering this mold, but she kept sneaking a peek into that jar to see what was really in that jam. He put it in front of her and said, "Eat, eat." There was nothing else she could do. So she said a quick prayer. She stuck it in her mouth. And it was amazing. Turns out it was the best bread and jam she'd ever had. Actually, she said, it was the most meaningful communion I've ever experienced. Taste. See. The Lord is most certainly good.